This photograph was taken sometime in 1945. The exact date is unclear, the location even more so. Was it Germany, or was it already enemy soil? The man in the foreground wears a German officer's uniform, his medal still pinned neatly to his chest. His face is rigid, almost hollow, as if bracing for something he cannot see. Behind him, a line of German soldiers walks forward in silence, boots crunching on gravel. Barbed wire coils along the fence. A watchtower rises in the distance, its windows dark. Who took this photograph? An Allied soldier, a camp official, or someone ordered never to ask questions? And who is this man, really? A commander, a prisoner, or someone standing at the exact moment when power collapses into captivity? What happened just before this image was frozen in time, and more importantly, what happened after? To understand this photograph, we must follow him through the wire. June 18, 1944. Camp Hearn, Texas. The smell reached us before we saw anything. It drifted across the gravel yard slowly, carried on air that shimmered with heat, warm and unfamiliar. Not the sour tang of latrines, not the metallic bite of disinfectant, not even smoke. This smell had weight to it. Rich, almost sweet, settling into the back of my throat before my mind could decide what it meant. I remember thinking, with sudden and irrational certainty, that it was the wrong smell for a prison. We stood in formation beneath the open sky, boots planted in pale Texas dust that burned through the soles if you stood too long without shifting. The sun pressed down without mercy. There were no walls close enough to touch, no shadows to retreat into. Only barbed wire in the distance and a line of low wooden barracks crouched beyond it, their roofs bleached nearly white by the sun. 3 days earlier, I had been a colonel in the Wehrmacht, responsible for men and maps and decisions that sent others forward while I remained behind. 3 days earlier, I had still believed the things we were taught to believe, that America was loud and chaotic, that democracy rotted from within, that its factories were idle and its people divided, kept alive only by propaganda and British stubbornness. We were told the Americans would make a spectacle of our capture, that they would parade us, strip us of rank, feed us just enough to keep us breathing. Revenge, our instructors said, would be their currency. The defeated always paid. I had prepared myself for that, for hunger, for shouting, for the humiliation of being reduced to a number, a burden, an inconvenience to be hidden away. I had not prepared myself for this. A truck engine idled nearby, patient, unhurried. A guard leaned against the side panel, his helmet pushed back, cigarette cupped loosely in one hand. He was not watching us with hatred. He was not watching us at all. His attention drifted toward the mess hall building where the smell seemed to originate. Smoke curling lazily from a metal vent near the roof line. The smell again. Meat, I thought, or grease. Something fried. Around me, men shifted slightly in their ranks, careful not to break formation. No one spoke. We had learned long ago that silence was safer than questions, but I could feel the confusion ripple through us, quiet and restrained, like heat rising off asphalt. This was America, then. We had crossed the Atlantic under guard, packed into the holds of a ship that smelled of salt and oil and bodies. During the crossing, I had imagined what waited on the other side. Ruins, perhaps. Camps thrown together in haste. Starving guards whose resentment would spill over onto us. A country drained dry by war, clinging to the edge of collapse. The Reich had been very clear on this point. Britain was finished. America was fractured. Their strength was illusion, propped up by numbers and noise. Once tested, it would crumble. Yet Camp Hearn did not look like a place built in desperation. The fences were straight, the posts evenly spaced. The gravel underfoot had been leveled, not scattered. Even the barracks, plain, unpainted wood, sat aligned as if someone had taken the time to measure distances and angles, to ensure order where chaos would have been easier. A bell rang somewhere beyond the yard. Not an alarm, not sharp or urgent. Just a single clear note that marked time passing, indifferent to who heard it. We were still waiting when an officer approached, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He stopped a few paces in front of us, adjusted the papers in his hands, and began to speak. His German was accented but careful, each word placed deliberately, as if precision mattered more than authority. "You will be processed shortly," he said. "Remain where you are." That was all. No threats, no insults. He turned and walked away, the conversation apparently complete. I searched his face as he left, looking for something I could recognize. Satisfaction, contempt, anything that fit the picture I carried with me across the ocean. I found none. Only focus, only routine. The smell grew stronger as the minutes passed. My stomach tightened, betraying me. I had eaten sparingly for weeks. Hunger had become a dull, familiar companion, something to be managed rather than resisted. This was different. This was hunger sharpened by confusion, by the unsettling possibility that what I sensed might be real. Behind the wire, a group of American soldiers carried wooden crates from a truck toward the mess hall. They moved without hurry, passing the boxes from hand to hand. One of them laughed at something the others couldn't hear. The sound was brief, unguarded, and entirely out of place. If this country was starving, it concealed the fact with disturbing competence. I thought of the lectures, of the maps shaded in red and blue, of the confident voices that assured us the enemy's cities burned, their people broken, their systems failing under the weight of their own contradictions. I had believed those voices because belief was required. Doubt was dangerous. Now doubt crept in anyway, carried on warm air and the scent of food. We were not being rushed. We were not being shouted at. No one struck us for standing too slowly or looking in the wrong direction. Time moved at its own pace here, regulated not by fear, but by schedule. Even captivity, it seemed, followed rules. This was not what we were told democracy looked like. I stood there, sweat gathering under my collar, dust clinging to my trousers, and watched an American sergeant straighten a stack of forms on a table set up near the barracks. He aligned the edges carefully, tapped them once to square the corners, and nodded to himself as if satisfied with the result. Order, everywhere I looked. It occurred to me then, quietly without drama, that whatever this place was, it was not collapsing. Whatever America had become after years of war, it had not forgotten how to function. And if that was true, then something else we had been taught might also be wrong. The bell rang again. The smell lingered, and for the first time since my capture, I felt something I had not prepared for at all. Uncertainty. The fear did not arrive all at once. It seeped in slowly, carried by memory rather than action. Long before I ever set foot on American soil, I had already met America through a radio. In the barracks back in Germany, the radio was never turned off. It murmured constantly in the background, between drills, during meals, late at night when sleep would not come. The voices that came through it were confident, certain, untroubled by doubt. They spoke of America as a place without discipline, without unity, without moral center. A nation held together by money and noise, not conviction. They told us the Americans fought with machines because they lacked courage, that their soldiers were soft, undisciplined, easily frightened, that behind the smiling posters and loud music was a people driven by resentment and revenge. "They will make you pay," one instructor said during a lecture, pacing slowly in front of a chalkboard. "They will humiliate you. That is how democracies fight. They do not understand honor. They understand spectacle." Pamphlets circulated as well, folded into pockets, pinned to notice boards. Crude illustrations. Captured German soldiers beaten in the streets. POW camps surrounded by jeering crowds. Captors with distorted faces, grinning as they starved their prisoners. The message was always the same, repeated until it felt less like information and more like gravity. Surrender meant degradation. There were other things whispered, too, things rarely said aloud but understood all the same. That America was not truly American, that it was controlled by outsiders, that chaos ruled there because hierarchy had been dismantled and replaced by resentment. We were told that captivity under such a system would be worse than death, because it would strip away not only the body, but the meaning attached to it. By the time I was captured, those ideas no longer felt like propaganda. They felt like preparation. The Eastern Front had provided its own education. Men came back from it changed, when they came back at all. Stories traveled faster than orders, POWs frozen into the ground, starved until they collapsed where they stood, guards who beat without reason, because cruelty required no justification. We learned from those stories that mercy was weakness, and weakness invited destruction. So when I arrived at Camp Hearn and saw no chains, no dogs, no shouting guards with rifles raised, my first instinct was not relief. It was suspicion. If they don't beat us, they're planning something worse. That thought took hold quickly and refused to let go. We were processed efficiently, quietly, moved from one station to the next without resistance or force. Names recorded, personal effects cataloged, instructions delivered in a tone so neutral it bordered on indifferent. The absence of violence was unsettling. It left too much space for imagination. At night, lying on a narrow cot beneath a single bare bulb, I listened to the sounds of the camp settling into sleep. Footsteps outside, measured and regular. A distant door closing. Somewhere, a radiator hissed softly as it warmed the room. These sounds should have been comforting. Instead, they sharpened my anxiety. In the dark, the whispers began. "They're softening us," someone muttered from the next cot. "Interrogation comes later." "They want information," another voice agreed. "They'll take their time." "They're starving their own people," a third said bitterly. "They can afford to feed us because it costs them nothing." I said nothing. Silence felt safer, but my mind filled the gaps anyway, constructing explanations to protect the world view I had carried across the ocean. This order, this calm, this restraint, it had to be a performance, a mask. Cruelty we understood. Silence made us imagine everything. The days passed without incident, and that too became a source of tension. We were given schedules. Roll calls conducted without shouting. Work assignments explained rather than barked. Meals arrived at regular intervals. Unremarkable, but sufficient. Always sufficient. I watched the guards carefully, searching for signs of the resentment we had been warned about. I found none. They performed their duties with a kind of practiced distance, neither friendly nor hostile. They did not linger to assert dominance. They did not avoid eye contact either. It was as if our presence required no emotional response at all. This unsettled me more than anger would have. If they hated us, I could understand that. Hatred follows rules. It burns hot, then fades. But this absence of passion, felt calculated, deliberate, as though the system itself had been designed to function without emotion. At breakfast one morning, I noticed that the guards ate the same meal we did. The same oatmeal, the same bread, the same weak coffee. No special rations, no separation of privilege. The realization lodged in my mind and refused to leave. America, we had been told, was drowning in excess. Its people greedy, its soldiers indulged. Yet here they were, eating plainly, efficiently, as if scarcity were a shared condition rather than a weapon to be wielded. Later, while working on a detail near the fence, I overheard two guards discussing ration books. Sugar, one said, was hard to come by. Meat, the other replied, was saved for special days. Their tone was not complaining, just factual. It dawned on me, slowly, that this country was not untouched by the war. It was disciplined by it. Back home, rationing had been framed as evidence of enemy weakness, proof that Britain and America could not sustain prolonged conflict. Yet the men guarding us accepted it as a matter of course, not as humiliation. They did not speak of it as sacrifice, but as obligation. This contradicted everything we had been taught. By 1944, America's factories were producing at a scale the world had never seen. Planes, tanks, ships, numbers so large they sounded fictional when spoken aloud. We had heard those figures too, dismissed them as exaggeration. But even if they were true, we were told, they came at a cost. Moral cost, social collapse. Standing there in the Texas sun, watching a guard carefully log supply numbers on a clipboard, I felt the first hairline crack form in that narrative. If they could have been cruel, why weren't they? That question grew louder with each passing day. No one struck us. No one deprived us to make a point. No one seemed interested in revenge. The system functioned without it. And that, more than any threat, made me uneasy. Because if kindness was not a tactic, if restraint was not weakness, then the war we thought we understood had been fought on terms we never learned to recognize. At night, the fear returned in waves. Not fear of pain, but fear of meaninglessness. Of having misjudged the world so completely that the foundations beneath my certainty began to dissolve. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of the radiator and the distant footsteps of guards changing shifts. Outside, the camp remained quiet, orderly, intact. This kindness had to be a trick. I told myself that again and again, clinging to it like a life raft. Because the alternative, that this was genuine, that America chose restraint not because it had to, but because it believed in it, was far more terrifying than any punishment I could imagine. The first real crack did not come from a gesture of warmth. It came from a clipboard. We were assembled one morning in a long room that had once served some other purpose before the war. The walls were plain, the windows tall and open to the heat, the air moving just enough to keep it from becoming oppressive. Folding tables had been arranged in rows. Paperwork lay stacked in careful piles. Pencils were aligned as if someone had taken the time to make sure their tips all pointed in the same direction. An American officer stood at the front of the room. He did not raise his voice. He did not wait for silence. He simply began speaking, and the room adjusted itself around him. "You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention," he said, reading from the page in his hand. His German was precise, practiced, stripped to flourish. "You will receive food, shelter, and medical care. Personal correspondence will be permitted. Religious observance will be accommodated. discipline will be enforced." He paused, turned the page, and continued. There was no emphasis, no moral framing, no attempt to persuade us of his country's virtue. It was delivered the way one might read a maintenance schedule or inventory list. Information, not ideology. I watched his face carefully. I had been trained to look for deception in small places. The tightening of the jaw, the flicker of amusement behind the eyes. I found nothing. He might have been briefing his own staff. We were not the audience. The system was. When he finished, he nodded once and stepped aside. That was the entire speech. No one applauded. No one reacted at all. We were directed to move forward one by one, to be issued our assigned items. A blanket, a tin cup, a printed sheet outlining camp regulations. Each item was handed over without ceremony. Names were checked against lists. A clerk marked boxes with neat strokes of his pen. This was not kindness as performance. This was kindness as procedure. My assigned sleeping quarters were located in one of the barracks near the edge of the compound. Inside, 12 cots line the walls, each made up identically. Clean sheets, a folded wool blanket at the foot, a thin pillow but intact. A radiator ran along the far wall, its metal surface warm to the touch. I stood there for a long moment, unsure what to do with my hands. I had slept in worse places as a free man, on concrete floors, in half-collapsed buildings, in command posts where the cold crept in through every crack. This was not luxury. It was simply sufficient. That was what unsettled me. At night, when the lights were dimmed, the radiator continued its quiet work. The warmth spread evenly, indifferent to rank or history. I lay on my cot and waited for the other thing to arrive. The interrogation, the punishment, the moment when the mask would slip. It did not come. Instead, morning arrived on schedule. Breakfast was served in a hall converted for the purpose. Long tables, benches, food placed in metal trays and carried out methodically. Oatmeal, bread, a small portion of meat, coffee that tasted more like water than anything else, but it was hot. I noticed again that the guards ate the same meal. No separate line, no better portions, no symbolic division between captor and captive. The realization was quiet, but it stayed with me as I ate, chewing slowly, aware of how carefully my mind was cataloging each inconsistency. Mail arrived later that week. A stack of letters, bundled with twine, was carried into the administrative building. Names were called. Men stepped forward, received envelopes, stepped back. The process was orderly, unemotional. I held the paper in my hands and felt something loosen in my chest that I had not realized was clenched. The letter had been opened and resealed, as expected. Certain lines were crossed out, but it was unmistakably my wife's handwriting. Familiar, steady, real. They could have withheld it. That thought came unbidden, and with it another, more uncomfortable one. They had chosen not to. In the days that followed, the pattern repeated itself. Medical inspections conducted without urgency or disdain. Requests logged and addressed. Minor disputes resolved through written warnings rather than force. Everything documented. Everything restrained. It became clear that no individual guard was responsible for our treatment. It was not generosity on a case-by-case basis. It was something larger, something impersonal, a system. I began to understand that the men around me were not being kind to us because they felt pity or curiosity. They were kind because that was how the system was built to function. Their personal feelings, whatever they were irrelevant. This realization changed the texture of my fear. If cruelty had been present, I could have blamed hatred. If mercy had been inconsistent, I could have blamed sentimentality. But this was neither. It was discipline. Outside the camp, the war continued. We knew that. Newspapers arrived late, stripped of headlines, but enough remained to sketch the outline of events. Casualty numbers. Battles named after places we had once marked on maps, and woven through it all, reminders that America itself was not spared from sacrifice. Rationing notices were posted in town. Sugar limited. Meat restricted. Gasoline monitored. The guards spoke of it casually, without resentment. Families back home made do. Victory gardens were planted. Everything directed toward the same end. This, too, had been misrepresented to us. We had been told that Americans indulged while others suffered. Yet here was evidence of restraint applied inward as well as outward. They limited themselves even as they fed their enemies. I watched a guard one afternoon carefully portion supplies in the storage area, counting items twice before signing off on the ledger. He did not look up when he finished. He simply closed the book and returned it to its shelf. This is what power looks like when it doesn't need to humiliate. The thought formed slowly, unwelcome and persistent. There were no speeches about freedom, no lectures on democracy, no attempt to convert us. The Americans did not seem interested in our approval. They were not performing for history. They were executing a set of rules because those rules existed. It occurred to me then that this restraint might not be kindness at all, at least not in the way I had been taught to understand it. It was something colder, more durable. A belief that systems mattered more than impulses, that dignity did not require an audience. I thought of my own army, of the way orders flowed downward, enforced by fear of reprisal rather than trust in structure, of how quickly rules bent when expedience demanded it. Strength, we had been told, came from dominance. Here, strength appeared to come from refusal to improvise cruelty, refusal to personalize power, refusal to abandon standards even when dealing with those who had not extended the same courtesy. That night, as I folded my blanket and set it neatly at the foot of the cot, I realized I was participating in the system without being asked to. The order of the place was seeping into me, not through command, but through example. This was not the America we had been shown. And the unsettling part was not that they were kinder than expected. It was that they were exactly as orderly as they claimed to be. Time did not loosen its grip on us all at once. It slowed instead, stretching into a rhythm that resisted both urgency and despair. Morning began with roll call. Not shouted, not barked. A bell rang, clear and unhurried, and we assembled in the yard while a sergeant walked the line with a clipboard, calling names in a voice that carried without effort. Each man answered. Each name was checked. When it was finished, we were dismissed with a nod. No insults followed us back to the barracks. No threats lingered in the air. Work assignments were posted on a board near the administrative building. Light labor, most of it. Maintenance, kitchen duty, groundskeeping. Tasks designed to occupy hands rather than break bodies. I was assigned to the vegetable garden behind the camp, a broad rectangle of soil bordered by wire fencing and rows of young plants already pushing through the earth. The work was steady and unremarkable. Weeding, turning soil, carrying water. It reminded me unexpectedly of summers before the war, before rank and responsibility had narrowed my world to maps and orders. The body remembered movements the mind had nearly forgotten. The guards overseeing us did not hover. They kept their distance, watching more for safety than control. One of them, a corporal, younger than many of the men he supervised, leaned against a fence post and whistled softly while we worked. The tune was unfamiliar, but the ease of it was not. At midday, we returned to the barracks for a short break. Some men lay on their cots. Others gathered near the windows, letting the breeze carry dust and heat through the room. Conversation remained cautious, but it no longer carried the same edge. Fear had not vanished. It had changed shape. In the afternoons, those not assigned to labor were permitted to use the library. The room had once been an office or perhaps a classroom. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books in English, German, and French, technical manuals, novels, history texts. A few volumes showed signs of heavy use, their spines cracked, pages softened by repeated handling. A chessboard sat on a table near the window. The pieces were mismatched, some wooden, others plastic, but the board itself was clean. Games began and ended without ceremony. No wagers, no arguments, just quiet concentration broken by the soft click of a piece placed deliberately. A radio rested on a shelf near the door. In the evenings it was turned on at low volume. BBC broadcasts came through clearly when the signal was strong. Other nights, American music drifted into the room, swing mostly. The melodies were upbeat, confident, oddly resilient. They spoke of a world that assumed tomorrow would arrive and expected to be ready for it. I watched the guards during these moments. Some listened absent-mindedly. Others tapped a foot. One young private, barely more than a boy, hummed along under his breath as he filled out paperwork at a nearby desk. There was nothing performative about it. He was not trying to demonstrate anything to us. He was simply existing in the same space. The Americans we encountered were not heroic figures. They did not speak in slogans or invoke grand ideals. They were clerks, medics, farmers in uniform, men and women doing jobs that needed to be done, with no apparent interest in being remembered for it. The camp nurse was a woman in her 30s with tired eyes and efficient hands. She treated minor injuries with the same detached care she might have given anyone. A cut finger was cleaned and bandaged. A cough was examined, noted, and monitored. She did not ask questions beyond what was necessary. She did not express sympathy or disdain. Her professionalism was complete. The camp doctor visited twice a week. An older man, balding with wire-rimmed glasses and a habit of adjusting them while he listened. He spoke German passably, enough to make himself understood. When he examined us, he did so thoroughly, methodically, as if each body were a problem to be solved rather than a symbol to be judged. Once, during a routine check, he paused and asked about an old injury to my shoulder. I explained briefly. He nodded, made a note, and suggested exercises to prevent stiffness. That was all. No lectures, no commentary. It was in the garden that the shift became undeniable. I was paired one morning with an American corporal assigned to supervise the work detail. His name was Miller. He had grown up on a farm in Kansas, he told me later, though at the time we worked in silence, pulling weeds from between the rows of vegetables while the sun climbed steadily overhead. After an hour, he straightened, wiped his hands on his trousers, and reached into his pocket. He held out a cigarette, without looking at me. I hesitated, then I accepted. We stood side by side, smoke curling upward, the earth dark and damp beneath our boots. There was no ceremony to it. No exchange of words that needed to be remembered. "You fought in Europe," he said eventually, his voice even. I nodded. "Lost my cousin over there," he added. "France." The statement hung between us. Not an accusation, not an appeal, just a fact. "I'm sorry," I said, though the words felt inadequate even as I spoke them. He shook his head. wasn't yours to apologize for. We finished our cigarettes and returned to work. That was the entirety of the conversation. No forgiveness offered. No absolution sought. Only an acknowledgment that loss existed on both sides of the wire and that it did not require resolution to be recognized. In the evenings after supper, some men gathered in the common area. Tea was available, thin but warm. Mugs were passed hand to hand. Conversations drifted, tentative but real. Books were exchanged, recommendations offered quietly as if unsure they were welcome. I found myself reading more than I had in years. Not manuals or reports, but novels. Stories about ordinary people navigating ordinary problems. The language was different, the assumptions unfamiliar, but the underlying concerns felt recognizable. Family, duty, regret. This, I realized, was perhaps the most unsettling part of all. The Americans were not asking us to admire them. They were not attempting to impress us with generosity or force us to acknowledge moral superiority. They were simply living according to a set of rules that applied to themselves as much as to us. There was no division between public virtue and private behavior. No sense that decency was a performance reserved for certain audiences. It existed in small, repeatable actions, in schedules kept, in supplies counted, in rules enforced without spectacle. This felt like the America my grandfather had once described, back when stories were still told by people who had lived them rather than by voices on the radio. A country where morality was not announced, but assumed. Where people did not need to declare their values because those values were embedded in how they moved through the day. There was no shouting here, no visible rage, no obsession with proving righteousness. The absence of those things created space for something else to emerge. Trust, perhaps, or at least the possibility of it. As the weeks passed, the camp settled into itself. The routines became familiar, predictable, and in that predictability, something softened. Men slept more easily. Laughter, quiet, cautious, appeared where there had once been only silence. I knew, even then, that this calm could not last forever, that something would come to test it. The war had not ended. Our captivity had not erased the past. But for the moment, in the slow cadence of daily life, surrounded by ordinary Americans doing ordinary work with unremarkable decency, it was possible to forget, just briefly, that we were enemies at all. And that, more than any act of cruelty, was what made the next realization inevitable. The letters began arriving more regularly as winter gave way to a hesitant spring. At first, they were short, careful, written in the clipped language of survival, stripped of detail as if detail itself were a luxury no one could afford. My wife described the weather, the difficulty of finding fuel, the cues, always the cues. She avoided mentioning names, avoided dates, avoided anything that might alarm me or be crossed out by a censor's pen. But absence has a way of speaking louder than words. Entire paragraphs were missing. Lines severed mid-sentence. Places where ink grew faint, as if the writer's hand had faltered, or perhaps paused too long over a thought that could not safely be committed to paper. Even without the details, the shape of the truth pressed through. Hamburg, she wrote, no longer looked like a city. It looked like something abandoned by time itself. Streets reduced to corridors of brick dust. Buildings standing only because they had not yet learned they were supposed to fall. Windows gone. Roofs gone. Nights spent in cellars that smelled of damp earth and fear. Food was scarce. Potatoes when they could be found. Bread stretched thin, cut thinner still. Children learned quickly not to complain. Adults learned not to expect. In another letter, written weeks later, she mentioned neighbors who had disappeared. A family down the street, gone. An elderly man who had once tended his garden with quiet pride. Dead, she thought, though no one could say for certain. The word famine was never used. It did not need to be. Each letter arrived in my hands warm from another man's touch, passed along a chain of clerks and guards and censors until it reached me intact enough to be devastating. I read them slowly, then read them again, as if repetition might soften the blow. Around me, the camp continued its routine. Breakfast was served on time. The oatmeal steamed gently in its metal container. Bread was distributed evenly. Coffee was poured without comment. At night, the radiator hissed and filled the barracks with steady warmth. The blankets were thick, the cots dry. I began to notice these things with a kind of unwanted clarity. I noticed that my hands no longer shook from cold when I woke, that my weight had stabilized, that the hollow ache of hunger had retreated into memory. I noticed that I slept through the night more often than not, and each time I noticed, the comparison formed automatically. Here, I slept under a heated roof. There, my wife melted frost from the inside of a window to drink. Here, I ate until I was full. There, children learned to ignore hunger because acknowledging it served no purpose. Here, guards addressed me by rank, recorded my name carefully, ensured my letters arrived. There, names were erased daily, buried beneath rubble and unmarked graves. The disparity grew unbearable. At first, I tried to justify it. I told myself that captivity was temporary, that the war would end soon, that Germany's suffering, however severe, was the result of enemy action, not ideology, that responsibility could be neatly assigned and therefore neatly absolved, but the letters would not allow such clean divisions. One afternoon, after receiving a particularly thin envelope, I sat on my cot long after the others had returned to their tasks. The paper trembled slightly in my hands, though the room was warm. My wife mentioned my brother in passing. A sentence, almost an afterthought. He had not survived the winter. There were no details, no cause given, just the quiet finality of the statement, as if elaboration were either impossible or pointless. Something in me gave way then, not with drama, not with tears. The collapse was internal, structural, like a support beam rotting unseen until the moment it could no longer bear weight. That evening, I went to the common room but could not bring myself to sit. Men were reading. A chess game was underway. The radio played softly in the background, a swing tune that seemed obscene in its optimism. I stood there, unable to reconcile the scene before me with the one unfolding in my mind. They feed us better than our own people. The words escaped my mouth before I could stop them. The room fell quiet. No one challenged the statement. No one contradicted it. Several men looked away. One closed his book slowly, as if marking a place he might not return to. The truth hung between us, heavy and unanswerable. For years I had believed that suffering was evidence of virtue, that endurance under hardship conferred moral authority, that those who endured most deserved to rule. It was a convenient belief, one that allowed pain to be framed as purpose. But here was suffering without dignity, endured by civilians who had not chosen it, while I, who had helped prolong the war, sat warm and fed behind barbed wire. The moral arithmetic did not balance. I could no longer blame the Americans. Their restraint was no longer suspect. It was simply a fact, one that grew more stark with every letter from home. They had the power to starve us. They chose not to. They had the power to humiliate us. They did not. This left only one conclusion, and it was the one I had avoided at all costs. Our suffering was not imposed from outside alone. It had been cultivated. The following days passed in a haze. I performed my assigned tasks mechanically. I spoke when spoken to. I ate without appetite, each bite carrying an aftertaste of guilt I could not swallow. At night, sleep eluded me. When it came, it brought dreams of empty streets and burning buildings, of familiar faces blurred beyond recognition. I woke drenched in sweat, the warmth of the room suddenly unbearable. I began to see the camp differently. The order that had once unsettled me now accused me. The fairness of the system, once suspicious, now highlighted the absence of such restraint in the world I had left behind. Every small kindness, a bandage applied, a letter delivered, a meal served without comment, stood in silent contrast to the chaos and deprivation described in my wife's careful handwriting. There was no longer any space for excuses. I could not blame propaganda. I had chosen to believe it. I could not blame ignorance. The evidence had been available, dismissed because it was inconvenient. I could not blame necessity. Too many decisions had been made with options unexamined, alternatives ignored. For the first time, I understood that defeat did not begin on the battlefield. It began with the willingness to abandon restraint. One evening, I found myself standing outside the barracks long after curfew, staring at the lights glowing faintly in the administrative building. A guard approached, reminded me of the rules, escorted me back inside. He did not raise his voice. He did not touch me. He wrote a note. That was all. The restraint in that moment broke something open in me. Back on my cot, I stared at the ceiling and tried, for the first time, to assign responsibility honestly. Not to history, not to circumstance, to myself. The realization was not that the Americans were good. It was that they did not need to prove it. They did not win by being worse. They did not rule by fear. They did not demand acknowledgement or gratitude. They simply applied their rules consistently, even when dealing with men who had not done the same. That consistency was devastating. It stripped away the last refuge of self-deception. I understood then that the world I had served no longer existed, if it ever had. That the moral framework I had relied upon was not merely flawed, but inverted. Strength had been mistaken for cruelty, unity for obedience, purpose for permission. The letters from home lay folded beside my bed, their edges worn soft from handling. Outside, the camp was quiet. Inside me, something had collapsed completely, leaving behind not relief, but clarity. The excursion was announced without explanation. Names were read during morning roll call. Mine was among them. We were instructed to prepare for departure after breakfast. No destination was given. No purpose stated. Compliance was assumed, not requested. We boarded a lorry under a clear sky and drove beyond the perimeter of the camp, past the fences and watchtowers that had come to define the boundaries of our days. The road stretched out ahead, narrow and well-maintained, bordered by fields that had begun to show signs of spring. Fresh green pushed through the soil in careful rows. Fences stood upright. Barns leaned slightly with age but remained intact. The countryside bore marks of war, but not surrender. As we approached the town, the damage became more apparent. A church spire rose above the rooftops, its stone darkened by soot, a section near the top chipped away by shrapnel. Several buildings along the main street stood scarred, their facades patched with mismatched brick, windows boarded where glass had not yet been replaced. Yet the street was not empty. Shops were open. A grocer swept dust from his doorway. A butcher's window displayed a modest arrangement of goods. People queued patiently, ration books in hand, talking quietly among themselves. Children darted between adults, their laughter cutting through the air with the careless confidence of youth. No one stared at us with hostility. A few glanced up as the lorry passed, curiosity flickering briefly across their faces before attention returned to the business of the day. An elderly woman inclined her head slightly, a gesture so ordinary it took me a moment to register it as acknowledgement. We disembarked near the town square. At its center stood a structure still under construction. Wooden scaffolding surrounded a stone base. A stonemason worked deliberately, chisel tapping against granite with measured precision. Names were being carved into the surface, each letter formed carefully without flourish. A memorial. The British officer accompanying us stood beside it, hands clasped behind his back. He did not speak at first. He allowed us to look, to count the names already etched into the stone, to notice how many spaces remained. "These are our dead," he said eventually, "civilians and soldiers from this town." The words were simple, unadorned. Beyond the square, life continued. A bus pulled to a stop. A man adjusted his bicycle chain. A woman emerged from a shop with a parcel tucked under her arm. Mourning and routine coexisted without ceremony. I thought of Germany, of monuments toppled or never built, of cities where rubble remained uncollected because there were more urgent uses for time and strength, of names that vanished without stone or record, absorbed into the enormity of loss. We were led through the town at an unhurried pace, past a schoolyard where children played a game whose rules I could not decipher, past a factory whose outer walls bore scorch marks from bombing, yet whose doors stood open. Inside, machines hummed. Men worked at benches, sleeves rolled up, movements practiced and efficient. Industry, wounded but alive. At the edge of a town, we paused near a small farm. Fields lay fallow in places, scarred by tracks and shallow craters, but fences had been repaired. A man guided a plow horse slowly along a furrow, his posture relaxed, as if war were an inconvenience rather than an all-consuming force. I struggled to reconcile the scene with the images I had carried for years. We had been told that democracy fractured under pressure, that it dissolved into disorder when tested, that it lacked the discipline required to endure hardship. Yet here was evidence of endurance without coercion, of recovery without spectacle. On the return journey, I found myself seated beside the officer. He was not young. Lines marked his face, not deeply, but enough to suggest years of responsibility rather than age alone. His uniform was neat, his manner reserved. I spoke before I had fully decided to. "You were bombed," I said. "Your people suffered." "Yes," he replied, "and yet you treat us as you do." He looked at me for a moment, considering. "We follow the law," he said finally, "because abandoning it would mean losing what we fought to preserve." There was no emphasis, no attempt to persuade. The statement was offered as fact, not argument. He continued, as if elaboration were unnecessary but provided anyway. "The Geneva Convention is not charity," he said. "It's discipline. It binds us to ourselves. Without it, victory would cost us more than defeat ever could." I absorbed the words slowly. In my own service, law had been presented as an obstacle, something to be circumvented in the pursuit of efficiency. Here it was treated as a foundation, something that restrained action precisely because action unrestrained became meaningless. The remainder of the drive passed in silence. Back at the camp, The gates closed behind us with the same measured finality as always. The familiar routines resumed. Men returned to their assigned duties. Supper was served. The radio played softly in the common room. Yet something had shifted irreversibly. For the first time, I understood that American strength did not reside primarily in its weapons or its factories, though it possessed both in abundance. It resided in consent. In the quiet agreement between citizens and institutions that rules would be followed even when inconvenient, that restraint would be exercised even when power made indulgence possible. Rule of law was not an abstraction here. It was visible in how supplies were logged, how disputes were handled, how names were recorded and remembered. Self-restraint was not weakness, it was practice. I thought of my own country's collapse, not just materially, but morally. Of how quickly principles were set aside in the name of urgency. Of how easily law became a tool rather than a limit. Of how violence, once justified, multiplied beyond control. The comparison was unavoidable. I wondered what happens to a society when morality becomes a weapon, wielded selectively, invoked loudly, then discarded. What happens when law serves ideology rather than restrains it? What happens when power is exercised to dominate rather than to preserve? These questions formed without answers. I did not know what America would become after the war. I did not know whether this restraint would endure, or whether it was a product of necessity, destined to fade once victory was secured. I did not know how my own country would reckon with what it had done, or whether it could, but I knew this. I had witnessed a system that functioned without terror, a society that absorbed damage without abandoning its structure. A victory that did not require humiliation to validate itself. The war had taught me strategy. Captivity was teaching me something else entirely. That strength, when it is real, does not announce itself. It simply holds. There was no ceremony to mark it, no speech to frame its significance. Names were read during morning roll call. Papers were issued. Instructions given in the same neutral tone that had governed everything else. We were told where to stand, what to carry, when to move. The system released us the same way it had held us, without emotion. I felt no joy, nor did I feel anger, only a kind of stillness, as if something inside me had already left ahead of my body. We packed our few belongings carefully. The blanket was folded and returned. The tin cup cleaned and placed back where it belonged. I walked the length of the camp one last time during permitted hours, noting details I had once ignored. The worn spot on the path near the garden gate, the slight sag in the fence where a post leaned, the sound of the bell that divided days into manageable pieces. Some of the guards nodded as we passed. One lifted a hand briefly, not quite a salute, not quite a farewell. I returned the gesture without thinking. There were no promises exchanged, no words that needed remembering. The lorry pulled away from Camp Hearn under a pale sky. Dust rose briefly, then settled. The fences receded into the distance until they were no longer distinguishable from the horizon. I did not look back. The journey east was long. The ship that carried us across the Atlantic did not smell of fear this time, only of oil and damp steel. I spent most of the crossing on deck when permitted, watching the water move endlessly beneath us, trying to imagine what waited on the other shore. Germany did not welcome us gently. Hamburg rose from the horizon in broken fragments. Buildings stood like exposed bones. Streets were choked with rubble and ash. The air carried a smell I recognized immediately. Smoke mixed with rot. The scent of things burned too thoroughly to be restored. food was scarce. That much became clear within hours. Queues stretched along streets that no longer had names. People waited patiently, resigned, clutching ration cards that promised less each week. Children moved quietly, as if noise itself were a luxury. The city did not hum. It endured. When neighbors learned where I had been, their reactions varied. Some asked questions, careful and curious. Others looked away. A few spoke openly, bitterness edging their words. "You were fed in America," one man said flatly, "while we starved." There was no accusation in his tone, just exhaustion. I did not argue. How could I explain that captivity had been the first place where the world made sense again? That order had existed there without terror, restraint without weakness? How could I describe the warmth of a radiator to someone who slept in a cellar with no roof overhead? Instead, I said very little. I took work where I could find it, clearing debris, repairing what could be salvaged. The days blurred together, marked by hunger and effort and the slow reconstruction of habits rather than buildings. At night, I wrote. At first, the writing was private, notes in the margins of old notebooks, sentences that circled the same thought without landing on it. Eventually, I began to shape the words into something more deliberate. Years passed. Germany rebuilt itself unevenly, painfully. Cities rose where rubble once lay. Shops reopened. Schools filled again. The war receded into memory, though it never vanished entirely. It lingered in silences, in missing names, in the way people avoided certain questions. I married again after my wife's death, raised children who knew the war only through stories and scars they could not see. They asked eventually about my time as a prisoner. I told them the truth, not all of it at once, not with bitterness or justification. I told them about the camp, about the routines, about the garden, about the American corporal who offered me a cigarette without asking for anything in return. They fed us when they didn't have to, I said. They followed rules when breaking them would have been easier. My children listened quietly. When my grandchildren were old enough to understand, I told them again. I told them that defeat was not what I had expected, that captivity had not been punishment, but reckoning, that the war had taught me how nations fight, but captivity had taught me how they endure. Some of those children grew up to travel. A few went to America. They returned with stories of their own, ordinary ones about people and places that felt strangely familiar. They spoke of kindness offered without ceremony, of order maintained without force. They looked at that country differently because of what they had been told. So did I. With time, the anger faded. Not because it was forgiven, but because it no longer served a purpose. What remained was something quieter. Gratitude, perhaps, though the word felt inadequate. Respect, recognition. Germany lost the war on the battlefield. That was undeniable. But what defeated us forever was not bombs, or hunger, or occupation. It was the humanity of the people who won. They did not need to crush us to prove their strength. They did not need to starve us to validate their victory. They simply held to their principles when abandoning them would have been easier. That was the lesson captivity delivered, long after the fighting had ended. Power that serves creation rather than domination leaves marks no propaganda can erase. I learned that too late to change the past, but early enough to pass it on, and that, in the end, was the only victory left to claim.